There's a 2-lane strip of gravel in the northern half of Alaska where your phone becomes a paperweight for nearly a full day's drive. There is no rumble strip to save you if you drift, no guardrail to catch you if you slide, and no tow truck within a couple hundred miles if your engine gives out at 50 below. Out here, a stalled car is not an inconvenience. It's the start of a clock nobody agreed to start. This is the James W. Dalton Highway, 414 miles of frozen gravel running from just north of Fairbanks to the oil terminals on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. There is no other way in and no other way out. Along the entire route, you will pass exactly 3 places where people actually live, and for hours at a stretch, you may not see another set of headlights coming the other way. In a bad year, this single road claims somewhere around 40 lives on a stretch of pavement, if you can even call it pavement, that most Americans will never once drive in their lifetime. And here is the detail that stops people cold. Several major rental car companies in the state will not let their own vehicles anywhere near it. That's not an exaggeration for a thumbnail. It's printed into the paperwork. Walk into most rental counters in Fairbanks or Anchorage and ask to take their car north past the pavement, and you'll be told flatly that the Dalton is off the approved list. Try it anyway, get caught, and you're not just voiding your insurance, you're often on the hook for a punishing daily surcharge, plus the full cost of whatever the gravel does to the vehicle. The road does not go easy on paint jobs, tires, or undercarriages, and the companies know it. So if you actually want to drive this thing legally in a rental, your options narrow down to a small handful of specialty outfitters. Names like Alaska 4x4 Rentals, Go North, and a couple of others willing to take the risk. And they don't hand you a compact sedan. You get a lifted 4x4 truck, at least one full-size spare already mounted and ready to swap, and almost always a CB radio thrown in. Because out here, a cell phone is dead weight, and the only voice for 100 miles belongs to whichever trucker happens to be rolling by on the same channel. Think about what that says. An entire slice of the rental industry looked at one specific road and built a separate set of rules just for it. Not to protect their paint, but to keep their name off the wrong kind of headline. Some agents will tell you flatly that the moment your tires leave pavement, whatever coverage you thought you had is gone, full stop, no exceptions negotiated after the fact. And for good reason. Across the 240-some miles between the settlement of Coldfoot and the end of the line at Deadhorse, there is no gas station, no diner, no motel, no mechanic, nothing. If your vehicle fails you in that gap, the company that rented it to you isn't sending anyone. You are on your own with whatever you packed. The ban isn't the industry being cautious. It's the industry telling you exactly what it thinks will happen if you go up there unprepared. To understand why the road is built this way, you have to go back to why it was built at all. In 1974, there was no highway here, just permafrost, mountains, and an oil company racing against a deadline. Crews needed a route to haul steel, fuel, and workers up to Prudhoe Bay, so construction could begin on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And they didn't have years to do it properly. They had months. So a construction crew for the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company bulldozed nearly 414 miles of gravel through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent in a single frantic season. And when it was finished, the state named it after James W. Dalton, an engineer who'd spent much of his career working the Arctic. This detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The road was never designed with a tourist in mind. It was an industrial supply line first, and the public was an afterthought bolted on much later, once the pipeline was already carrying oil and the state finally took the road over as its own. For years, ordinary drivers weren't even allowed past a checkpoint at mile 211. Well short of the mountains and the coast, the state didn't open the entire stretch to civilian traffic until 1994, 2 full decades after the first bulldozer cut through the tundra. Every time you drive it today, you're a guest on a working haul road that happens to tolerate you riding alongside a silver pipeline that is the only reason any of this exists in the first place, a road built to move steel and diesel, not sightseers. So, what does that industrial road actually feel like under your tires? Mostly, it's raw gravel. No center line for long stretches, no reflective markers to guide you through the dark. After rain, the surface turns into a greasy slurry of mud and calcium chloride that grabs the wheel and won't let go. In dry weather, it's the opposite problem. Every semi that passes throws up a rolling wall of dust, thick enough to blind you for a few full seconds at highway speed. Add potholes deep enough to bend a rim, frost heaves that can launch a vehicle if you hit them too fast, and loose stone flying off truck tires hard enough to spiderweb a windshield, and you start to understand why the truckers who drive this route for a living have given nicknames to its worst sections. A steep, sliding grade called the Beaver Slide, a stretch simply known as Oil Spill Hill, a dipping run of blind crests the old hands just call the roller coaster. These aren't cute names dreamed up for tourists. They're warnings passed down the CB channel from one driver to the next, shorthand for exactly where the last close call happened. This isn't a scenic road with a few rough patches. It's several hundred miles of surface actively working against you, and it doesn't need a dramatic mistake to end badly. A moment of bad luck at the wrong mile marker is more than enough. And it is long. Genuinely, punishingly long. Covering the full route isn't a weekend outing. It typically eats the better part of a full day of driving each way once you count the approach from Fairbanks, longer if the weather turns. For huge stretches of it, you might not see another headlight for an hour at a time. You crest a rise expecting some sign of civilization, and instead see the gravel just keep unspooling toward the horizon, empty in every direction, with nothing but tundra, low ridgeline, and the silver thread of the pipeline for company. That kind of solitude is stunning for the first 10 minutes. Then it quietly becomes the entire problem, because every mile you put behind you is another mile between you and anyone who could actually help. And the road keeps stretching north, completely indifferent to how far you've already committed. There's no mile marker that tells you when you've gone too far to turn back easily. You just find out later when it matters. Before we go further north on this road, if a video like this is useful to you, take a second to subscribe. What these people failed to do was subscribing to our channel. Just kidding, but if you subscribe, you will never miss out on life-saving information. There is one habit every experienced Dalton driver treats like scripture, and it revolves entirely around gasoline. Along the full 414 miles, fuel exists in exactly 3 locations. There's a small station near the Yukon River crossing, roughly mile 56. There's Coldfoot sitting around mile 175. And then there's Dead Horse, all the way at the very end. That's the complete list. In between Coldfoot and Dead Horse, nearly 240 miles, there is not one pump, which is why the rule never bends. Top off the tank at every single opportunity, no matter how much fuel you think is left, no matter how recently you last filled up. The cold burns through range faster than you'd expect. The climbs eat more than flat highway ever would, and the gravel itself adds. Drag you don't notice until the needle drops faster than the math said it should. People misjudge this every single year. They pass a pump, certain they have enough, telling themselves the next stop is close enough, and somewhere in that empty middle stretch, they find out exactly how wrong they were. There's no roadside service to call and no station wagon idling nearby with a spare can. There is only the gauge, dropping, and the mile markers, which do not care what you assumed back at the last pump. Here's the part that actually explains how this road kills people, and it rarely starts with anything dramatic. A flat tire almost anywhere else in the country is a minor inconvenience. You coast to the shoulder, make a call, wait for help. On the Dalton, every part of that sequence is missing. There's no signal to place the call. There's often no real shoulder to pull onto. The nearest tow service might be operating out of a town 200 miles away, and even if someone's coming, it could be hours before they arrive. So picture it. Your tire blows on a gravel curve with a drop-off just past the edge, or your battery quits in the deep cold, or you slide off the road's crown into a ditch with no traction to climb back out, or the engine simply floods and refuses to turn over. Any one of those is a footnote anywhere else in America, a story you tell later about the tow truck that came in the afternoon you lost. Out here, The road takes a small mechanical failure and slowly, patiently, turns it into a genuine survival situation, and it doesn't need to try particularly hard to do it. And when the crash itself doesn't finish the job, the cold usually does. This is Arctic Alaska. Winter temperatures on the Dalton routinely fall to 60 below zero, and the region has recorded lows deep into the 80s below on its worst nights. At that kind of cold, a stalled engine stops generating heat within minutes, and once that warmth is gone, your body is fighting numbers it was never designed to survive. Skin left exposed can suffer frostbite in roughly the time it takes to change a tire barehanded. Hypothermia sets in quietly not long after, working while you wait on help that has no idea you're even out there. Throw in wind, and the road can disappear entirely into a ground blizzard, so total you can't see past your own hood ornament. Metal contracts, plastic goes brittle, and anything mechanical that was already marginal tends to fail exactly when you need it most. Out here, the heater isn't a comfort feature. It's closer to life support with a countdown timer built into the fuel gauge. And once that gauge hits empty, the countdown is the only thing left running. But the cold isn't even the road's cruelest trick. Somewhere north of Coldfoot, the highway slams directly into the Brooks Range, and it has to climb straight over the top of it at a place called Adigan Pass. Adigan sits at roughly 4,739 feet, the highest year-round highway pass anywhere in Alaska, with grades that push past 10% and, in spots, reportedly climb even steeper. It's tight, narrow, and unforgiving in both directions. Trucks either grinding uphill against gravity or riding their brakes down a gravel track with a sheer mountainside on one side and open air on the other. Above the road, snow builds all winter along steep avalanche chutes, with essentially no warning system beyond weather monitoring equipment installed by the state. It's the one section of the Dalton that shows up on virtually every list of America's most dangerous roads, and it earns that spot without needing any embellishment. Even in the height of summer, a sudden cold snap can leave black ice glazed across that same steep grade overnight, invisible until a tire is already sliding on it. Documented slides here have buried stretches of highway under feet of debris in a matter of minutes, sealing the pass shut and stranding whoever happened to already be on it. This is the one place on the entire route where the mountain, not the driver, gets the final vote. That kind of closure isn't rare either. State crews have had to shut down and physically dig out sections of Adigan Pass after slides more than once over the years, sometimes for a full day or longer before the road is passable again. When it happens, there is no detour. Adigan is the only place a road crosses this particular stretch of the Brooks Range, which means if the pass is buried, you are not going around it. You are simply waiting, however long the mountain decides that takes. This is really the truest thing you can say about the entire highway. When something goes wrong up here, help isn't just far away. It's operating on a completely different scale of time than what you're used to. There's no ambulance idling a few minutes out. The closest serious medical care sits either back in Fairbanks or all the way up in Deadhorse, with hundreds of miles of gravel and mountains separating the two. If an injury is serious enough, your fastest realistic option is a medevac flight, and that aircraft has to fly through the exact same brutal weather that likely caused the emergency in the first place. A storm bad enough to close the pass is also bad enough to ground the helicopter. On the Dalton, response time isn't measured in minutes, it's measured in hours on a good day, and on a genuinely bad one in most of a day, since even a ground crew driving up from Fairbanks has to cover the same gravel at the same reduced speeds everyone else is stuck at. The version of an ambulance most people have relied on their whole lives, the one that simply shows up when you dial 3 numbers, doesn't really exist out here. It's closer to a hopeful idea, and even that idea grounds itself the moment the weather turns against it. Put an actual number on all of this, and the figure that keeps surfacing is somewhere around 40 fatal crashes in a rough year, spread across those same 414 miles. Sit with how small the population up here actually is. This isn't a crowded interstate. It's one of the emptiest roads in the entire country, and it still manages to fill out a grim yearly tally almost every single season. Most of the traffic responsible for keeping that road alive isn't tourists at all. It's commercial trucking. Massive rigs hauling fuel, pipe, and supplies north to Prudhoe Bay, then running back down empty to do it again. They move at speed because they're on a schedule, and when two of them pass each other on a narrow gravel straightaway, the dust closes in like a curtain and blinds both drivers for a few very real seconds. That's where a lot of the danger actually lives. Not on the dramatic mountain pass everyone talks about, but on an ordinary flat section in an ordinary dust cloud, on what looked like an ordinary day. A cable network built an entire multi-season reality show around drivers hauling loads through exactly this kind of Arctic terrain, and Atagun Pass specifically became one of its signature backdrops, turning a working haul road into something millions of people watched from the comfort of their living rooms. The show eventually ended its run. The road, and the trucks that depend on it, never stopped and never will, because the oil camps at the far end still need fuel, parts and food delivered on a schedule that doesn't pause for a bad forecast. And in a strange twist, those same truckers are usually the closest thing to a rescue service that exists out here. If you break down, the person most likely to actually find you is behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, not a park ranger or a state trooper. If you look closely at how a lot of these crashes actually happen, the pattern is almost always the same, and it isn't dramatic at all. It's the edge of the road itself. Along much of the Dalton, the shoulders look solid, packed gravel that appears to be an extension of the driving surface, but they're not engineered to bear the weight of a loaded truck, and for most of the highway's length, there has never been a guardrail to catch a vehicle that drifts too far right. A tire slips off the road's crown. The ground beneath it gives way faster than it should, and in the half second it takes for that wheel to sink, a fully loaded rig becomes something no amount of steering can pull back from the embankment below. State transportation crews have only recently begun installing guardrails and rebuilding bridges along parts of the corridor, decades after the road first opened to the public, which tells you plainly how long that particular danger has simply been accepted as the cost of using it. For most of this highway's history, the edge of the gravel and the edge of survivable driving have been the exact same line, with nothing built in between them. That's the genuine cruelty baked into this highway. It doesn't require a driver to make some enormous obvious error. There's essentially no margin built in anywhere along its length. So the smallest miscalculation, a few inches too far toward the shoulders, is more than sufficient. Every mile carries that same soft, unguarded edge. Every mile is quietly waiting for that one small inch. So who actually chooses to drive a road like this on purpose? Overwhelmingly, it's the professional trucking crews who keep the entire North Slope operation running. Nothing moves in or out of Prudhoe Bay without them. No diesel, no equipment, no groceries for the camps. They run it through total darkness, through blinding cold, through whiteouts that would keep almost anyone else parked, with a CB radio as their only real connection to another human being for 100 miles at a stretch. For most of the country, this road's public reputation was built almost entirely on their backs, thanks to the reality show that followed them. Now contrast that against the version of preparedness veterans actually bring with them. The specialty rental companies mount that extra spare and toss in a CB radio for a very specific reason. Longtime Dalton drivers don't just carry tools, they carry backup fuel, extra food and water, cold weather gear rated for temperatures most people will never personally feel, a paper map in case the GPS sends them down a dead-end trail, and above all, they carry patience, a willingness to simply wait out a storm for hours if the road forces the issue. They treat every single trip up here as though something could go sideways, because on this particular stretch of gravel, it genuinely can, and they'd rather lose an afternoon sitting still than lose far more trying to push through. What these people failed to do was subscribing to our channel. Just kidding, but if you subscribe, you will never miss out on life-saving information. Now picture the opposite kind of traveler. Someone who saw a photo of the Arctic Circle sign online and decided on a whim to make the drive in a compact sedan. Their rental agreement specifically told them to keep off this exact road. Dead phone, a tank they assumed was full enough, and a general feeling that it would probably be fine. The highway doesn't send a warning to that person. It doesn't slow itself down out of courtesy. It simply, quietly sorts the prepared from the unprepared, 1 mile marker at a time, and it never announces the final score until it's far too late to do anything about it. Roughly 115 miles up, there's a modest wooden sign marking the Arctic Circle, and almost everyone stops there for the obligatory photo. For most travelers, it feels like the actual destination. In reality, it's a warning wearing the costume of a landmark. North of that sign, the country genuinely changes. The spruce forest thins out and eventually disappears entirely, and the gaps between any sign of civilization stretch wider and wider. The drive back south, the one nobody's thinking about while snapping the photo, becomes its own full undertaking across the same gravel you just crossed. Past that sign, this stops being a novelty road trip and becomes a real logistical commitment, because every mile you push forward is a mile you'll have to earn back a second time in reverse. Before any of that, though, there's the river. Around mile 56, the highway reaches the Yukon and crosses it on a long wooden-decked bridge that carries both the road and the pipeline together, side by side, over the water. This is essentially the final landmark of the world most people are used to. There's a modest fuel stop nearby, one of only 3 on the entire route, and then the road climbs away from the river and the services thin out toward almost nothing. Past the Yukon, the pipeline keeps running alongside you for mile after mile, a steady visual reminder of exactly why this road exists and whose priorities it was actually built around. Crossing that bridge is the moment the trip stops feeling like a scenic drive. On one side sits the familiar world, cell towers, gas stations, someone to call. On the other sits several hundred miles of country that has no particular interest in whether you make it through, and no obligation to notice if you don't. Picture how this usually plays out in the worst-case version. It's deep winter, and a ground blizzard rolls in off the open tundra, throwing snow sideways until the entire world turns white in every direction. You can't see the gravel beneath your tires. You can't see where the edge of the road actually is. You can't see whether a loaded truck might be barreling toward you from the opposite direction. So you slow down, and eventually you stop completely because there's genuinely nothing else left to do. And the instant you stop, you become the single most dangerous object on the entire highway. A motionless vehicle on a road nobody else can see either, with no signal to call for help, no real shoulder to pull fully clear onto, and no town for 100 miles in either direction. This is exactly the trap the road sets, and it doesn't spring shut quickly. It tightens gradually over hours while the cabin loses heat and the fuel gauge keeps dropping and the white outside refuses to break. Scattered across all that emptiness are exactly 3 small pockets of human warmth. Coldfoot, at roughly mile 175, holds a tiny year-round population and a truck stop that functions as basically the only lit window for 100 miles in any direction. A little further along sits Wiseman, home to only a handful of residents. And at the very end of the road, Deadhorse holds a small permanent population that swells into the thousands whenever the oil operation is running at full capacity. That's the complete list of settlements along 414 miles. Between Coldfoot and Deadhorse, that single truck stop you pass is the only door that's actually going to open for you. In most of the country, help is a phone call and a handful of minutes away. Up here, it's a specific building, hours behind you, staffed by a small group of people who chose to live at the very edge of the map. And everything between those buildings, every one of those miles, belongs entirely to whoever is driving it. And here's the truth that outlasts every other fact about this road. It isn't ever going to be fixed. Anywhere else in the country, a highway with this kind of death toll would eventually get straightened, paved, gated, or shut down whenever conditions turn dangerous. This one can't be, because the oil has to keep moving. The pipeline has to stay fed regardless of the weather, and closures here reportedly cost the regional economy roughly $1 million for every day the road stays shut. That single fact sits at the center of everything else about the Dalton. Every whiteout, every unguarded shoulder, every mile with no signal remains exactly as dangerous today as it was the day the road opened, because the alternative is cutting off the flow of oil entirely, and that simply isn't going to happen. The Dalton was built to feed a pipeline, and it will stay open, and stay just as lethal, for as long as that pipeline keeps running. So, go back to where this started. An empty ribbon of gravel running north with no signal, no real shoulder, and nobody coming to check on you anytime soon. Now you know exactly what that emptiness actually costs. You know about the soft, unguarded edges, that have taken far more lives than the mountain pass ever gets credit for. You know about the roughly 40 people a year who start driving north and never make it to Deadhorse. The road is still out there tonight. 414 miles of frozen gravel. Exactly as indifferent as it was before you'd ever heard its name. And here's the last thing worth carrying with you. On the worst nights up there, the nearest real help can sit hundreds of miles away, grounded by the exact same storm that stopped you in the first place. Which means the one promise every other American road quietly makes, that someone eventually is coming, is a promise this particular highway simply cannot make. Out there in the white and the 60 below dark, help isn't delayed. It's absent. And the road has understood that about itself since the very first mile of gravel was laid down. Back when it was never meant to carry anyone but the crews building a pipeline, nobody outside Alaska ever expected the rest of us to drive alongside.